Hello readers, I'm the Average Reader and today we're reviewing Monsoon, the Indian Ocean and the Future of American Power, written by Robert Kaplan in 2010. So this book is about the Indian Ocean and the literal countries that border it. So there are chapters in this book on India, on Pakistan, on Bangladesh, on Sri Lanka, on Oman, on Burma, on Indonesia, and on Somalia and Zanzibar. And the central argument in this book is that these countries are connected through the Indian Ocean and the monsoon. So the monsoon is basically a wind in the Indian Ocean. So during the middle of the year, the wind flows from the southwest, and towards the end of the year, the wind flows from the northeast. Through this way, since a long time, you could travel by boat from the southwest to the northeast in the middle of the year, and then towards the end of the year, you could travel back from the northeast to the southwest. This has meant that there has been a lot of trade between countries in the Indian Ocean. And this book also analyzes, okay, how does this affect the future of American power? As you're having the rise of India and China now as potential great powers, how will America survive in this multipolar world in the Indian Ocean? And Kaplan also believes that the Indian Ocean is going to become the most important region in the world. And the Indian Ocean is gigantic. It starts in East Africa and it goes all the way to Indonesia or so. And I believe this is a good introduction to the subject. There's a lot of astute geopolitical analysis in this book by Robert Kaplan, but it's also a little overlong as he goes into the background of some imperial history in the region. So there are several chapters that are about that. I'm gonna skip over that and talk about more of the geopolitics about the different countries. So first of all, let's make clear how the future great powers, India and China, intend to spread their influence. So China wants to spread their influence vertically, while India wants to spread their influence horizontally. So India wants to dominate the Indian subcontinent, while China wants to dominate the South China Sea and also parts of the Indian Ocean. So the first country that Robert Kaplan talks about is Oman. And Oman is particular in the Middle East. First of all, it has a different form of Islam than all other Muslim countries. Muslims in Oman are called Ibadis, and these types of Muslims are much more tolerant than Sunnis or Shias. There isn't a large concentration of jihadis in Oman, and Oman is a relatively small country, only about 3 million people, and Oman was lucky to be under the benevolent rule of Qabus for decades and decades. So he came to power in 1970, and when this book was written in 2010, he was still in power. And this is a relatively tolerant, liberal dictatorship, you could say, similar a bit to Singapore, although not as wealthy. You don't have any mass executions like in Saudi Arabia. Freedom of speech in the press is restricted, but not as much as in other dictatorships. And things are pretty stable. You have a minority of other religions there. They're tolerated. The mosques that are built there are syncretic instead of ostentatious. So Oman is a good example of what an enlightened despot is under Qabus, although Oman may have to start to liberalize more and globalize and democratize. Then there are several chapters in this book about India. So first of all, India is a non-aligned country, but they're going to be tilting more pro-American than Chinese. And the United States, they're decreasing their naval presence in the region. The rise of Indian power is not bad for the United States as it provides a useful counterweight to China. The odd thing with India is that it's the only stable democracy in the Indian subcontinent region. Countries that surround it, so Burma, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, they are semi-failed states. And India and China, while they may be rivals, India does not worry that much about China. They worry much more about Pakistan. And in this book, Kaplan delves more deeply in India by looking at different regions. So he talks about the development in Gujarat under the rule of Chief Minister Narendra Modi. So of course, Narendra Modi is the Prime Minister of India now, but back in 2010 he was the Chief Minister of Gujarat, and he was kind of a strong man, but he was also an effective leader. So his goal was basically, we're gonna reduce the bureaucracy but make it hyper effective. So during that time, half of the new jobs that were created in India came from Gujarat. Gujarat has also a dark side. They had riots in 2002. It's the Indian equivalent of 9/11. So what happened there was that Islamic terrorists killed people on trains, Hindus. In response to this, Modi fomented Hindu hate towards Muslims, and this ended with 2,000 Muslims being killed in the region, 20,000 Muslim women in Gujarat were raped, and 200,000 Muslims in Gujarat were made homeless. So the development policy in Gujarat is focused on the Hindus. He doesn't care at all about the Muslim minority there. This was one dark episode in the region. Since 2002, you haven't had a riot like that in Gujarat. And India is quite a successful multi-party democracy, and their political system has tamed Modi's tendencies, so he's not that much of an authoritarian. And there is a syncretic culture in India, so there is a tolerance of Islam there, and Hindu and Islamic culture have peacefully coexisted successfully for the most part. Then you have Kolkata in West Bengal, and this is an example of the new dynamic Indian culture. So you have a bunch of rickshaws in West Bengal. You have some Bangladeshis who have immigrated there. The people are poor, but they work hard and they're ambitious. And while Kolkata is poor, their slums are preferable to what you have in Bangladesh. So the next country Kaplan talks about is Pakistan. And Pakistan officially has a civilian government, but in practice, it's the military that dominates the country. This military is dominated by Punjabis, and these Punjabis mistreat the minorities in Pakistan. So you have a Punjab military presence in the Baluch and Sindh regions. Muslims in Baluchistan are actually much more secular than other Pakistanis. And Pakistan has a lot of internal problems with some insurgents in the Sindh and Baluch regions who are resisting the Pakistanis, the Punjabis. And the solution to this is decentralization and more democratization. So the Punjabis have used the military to dominate the property market in Baluchistan. And the only real solution to this, to keep Pakistan united, is decentralization. Otherwise, you have the Baluchs and the Sindhis who are thinking about forming a confederation together. A separate Baluchistan state is much more feasible than a separate Sindh state. Then Robert Kaplan talks about Bangladesh. And here you have democratic politics. However, the two-party system there is dominated by two political dynasties. And these political parties also appeal to the jihadist element in Bangladeshi culture. And the central government in Bangladesh is quite ineffective with all the natural disasters that occur. So then you have had the village culture that has formed thanks to the regular floods in Bangladesh, where they take care of themselves. You have a strong humanitarian NGO presence in Bangladesh, and a lot of these NGOs are for profit and they work locally with the people to help them. But in the urbanizing areas of Bangladesh, people are becoming jihadists. Bangladesh is also one of the main countries that is affected by climate change, as regular floods make a lot of Bengalis homeless regularly. Then Kaplan talks about Sri Lanka. And the thing with Sri Lanka, since they became independent from Britain, they've always been democratic. They have never been a dictatorship. However, this democracy has not always been liberal. So in Sri Lanka, the Sinhalese, who are the majority in Sri Lanka, and who are Buddhists, they have discriminated against the Tamils, who are often but not always Hindus. And in response to this, the Tamils have formed insurgencies in the north of Sri Lanka under the Tamil Tigers, which was under the leadership of Prabhakaran. And the Tamil Tigers are terrorists that are comparable to Al-Qaeda. They're the ones who actually started this thing with suicide bombers. And when the Rajapaksa dynasty came to power in the early 2000s, they used brutal measures to crush the Tamil Tigers between 2005 to 2009, and in 2009 Prabhakaran was killed, so now the Tamil Tigers are basically destroyed and Sri Lanka can start the process of rebuilding. And this is an example Kaplan points out that the government used measures that the West would condemn as it's very authoritarian, very brutal. So Western and Indian aid to Sri Lanka was cut off. So the ones who actually backed the Sinhalese militarily were the Chinese by sending in guns and things like that, as China is ready to help countries even if they're horrible. And one reason that India cannot be that friendly with Sri Lanka is that they have a Tamil minority of their own. In southern India, right next to Sri Lanka, you have Tamil Nadu, where you have a Tamil population, and they despise Sri Lanka. Then Robert Kaplan talks about Burma, and Burma has been one of the most brutal countries in Asia. They have been ruled for a long time by a military junta, and you have constant insurgencies in Burma against the dominant Burmans. So the Shan, Karen and Arakan peoples, they have constantly rebelled against the Burmese government. And in neighboring Thailand, the military and the royal family has been pro insurgents, while ironically the civil democratic government in Thailand has been pro the military junta in Burma. The Chinese have been kind of backing the Burmese government, and for Burma to become successful, the solution is of course decentralization, which would be the implementation of the Panglong 1947 agreement, which was made by the democratic leader in Burma, but he was later killed, and so this agreement was never implemented. And you've had the democratic movement here under Aung San Suu Kyi, who are Burmans who are in favor of democracy. And of course, as we know, they tried democracy for 10 years, then the junta made a coup and came back to power. So although they had elections in 2010 and then some elections after that, they have returned to the junta status quo. The final country in Asia that Kaplan talks about is Indonesia. And Islam in Indonesia is quite different than Islam in the Middle East. So Islam was brought to Indonesia through merchants, which is different from the Middle East where Islam was brought by the sword. So people became voluntarily Muslim in Indonesia, and thus the Islamic culture in Indonesia is much more syncretic, much more tolerant of other religions like Christianity, Buddhism, Hinduism. So you have a weird phenomena in Indonesia. The women there, they wear hijabs. All Muslim women basically wear hijabs, but they wear tight jeans, and some of the Muslim women there even wear tank tops, and the women there are not horribly treated as in other Islamic countries. And even in the most religious part of Indonesia, Aceh, which officially is under Sharia law, you're allowed to drink beer there. So 85% of Indonesians do not favor Sharia law, and they are not at all sympathetic to the jihadist terrorists who have killed people in Indonesia. They did not mind when the Indonesian government hanged Islamic terrorists. And you do still have a 15% minority of people in Indonesia who are not Muslims, and these are mainly Christians, Hindus, and Buddhists. And Indonesia is a secular country, so they're not mistreated. And Indonesia has become an example of a successful democracy in the Islamic world. So they may be becoming the future tolerant version of Islam, which include news outlets such as Al Jazeera, which Al Jazeera, yeah, you may not like them, but Al Jazeera is promoting a center-left vision of the world, which is decent for an Islamic country. And you've had previously anti-Chinese sentiment in Indonesia, but the last time you had riots against the Chinese in Indonesia was in 1998. And Indonesia, they're developing economically, but they still have a quite small military. At least in 2010, they had a smaller military budget than Singapore, and Singapore is a tiny country. Indonesia is a huge country. At the time of this book, there were 240 million people there, and their army was comparable to Malaysia, which was a tenth of the size. But the military strategy is basically they're, okay, we're gonna have economic development so we can spend more money on our military. And Indonesia has decentralized so that the different cultures can coexist with each other on the different islands. The only problem with Indonesia is that they have a weak military, so they could easily be picked off by other countries surrounding them, but their economic development may give them a big military soon, so that shouldn't be a problem in the long run. Then Kaplan talks about that China's economic rise may not be bad necessarily. The United States and China do share common interests in some aspects, so they could collaborate on that. They could coexist peacefully in a multipolar world, as the Chinese government, at least at the time in 2010 under Hu Jintao, were not really inherently jingoistic. But of course this was written when China was governed by Hu Jintao. Now they have Xi Jinping, which changes the dynamic a bit. But China is not that big of a threat to the United States. That's the main point. And they are successfully coexisting with India for the most part. And China becomes a great power through a two-ocean strategy, so maintaining a naval presence in the Indian Ocean and in the Western Pacific to protect their merchant fleets. And they are also heavily investing into Africa, without having all these strings attached as the West has in relation to human rights. So Kaplan moves on to talk about Africa, and they are developing quite fast. In the 2000s, they had about 10% GDP growth rates each year. He talks specifically also about the piracy in Somalia. And Somalia is basically split into three parts in practice. So you have the northwest, which is democratic Somaliland. You have the south, where you have Al-Shabaab, so jihadists, fighting the central government. And then you have the northeast, Puntland, which is where you have the pirates. It's a tribal society, so the tribes control the government there, and it's semi-functional. And they make their money from ransoms, from piracy. So you've had pirates hijacking a lot of cargo there, going after those and larger vessels. And here's an example where the great powers all have an interest in crushing this piracy. I believe that quite recently, in the last few years, piracy has basically ended off the coast in Somalia. I may be wrong about that, but this was a problem in 2010. I'm not sure if it's a problem anymore. Kaplan says that to address piracy, in 2010 at least, you have to address the grinding poverty which was present in northeast Somalia, Puntland. Final place that Kaplan talks about is Zanzibar. So Zanzibar is an island off the coast of Tanzania. They're part of Tanzania since the 60s. And they have multiple ethnic groups there, so the majority of people are Africans, but they also have a minority of other people, so people such as Indians and Omanis. The Africans have mistreated the other minorities, so a lot of Omanis emigrated away from Zanzibar. And the final lesson of this book is that basically the United States needs to learn to live in a multipolar world, where you have rising powers such as China and India. And that's the book. So how would I rate Monsoon by Robert Kaplan? I'm gonna give it an 8 out of 10. This book, I'm gonna place it above The Coming Anarchy, but below Asia's Cauldron. There's a lot of good geopolitical analysis here of different countries, the importance of decentralization to have peace within a country, for example. Kaplan digresses here a lot to go through the history of the Indian Ocean, which sometimes that's fine, but sometimes it's too much. So a lot of chapters in this book. The first half is a history lesson, the second half is geopolitical analysis. I come to Kaplan for the geopolitical analysis. Some history is fine, but sometimes it's too much. He talks a lot about the Portuguese, the Dutch, the British Empire, but otherwise it's a good book. And if it didn't have those digressions, it would be a great book, like Asia's Cauldron. And this is a good companion novel actually to Asia's Cauldron. Asia's Cauldron is about the South China Sea. This is about the Indian Ocean. So Monsoon is definitely a good introduction to the geopolitics of the Indian Ocean. You learn about the success stories in this book of India, of Oman, of Indonesia. You also learn of the failures such as in Pakistan, as in Zanzibar, and in Burma. And the thing with this book is that it is written in 2010, so it's not up to date with every geopolitical event recently, as 13 years have passed since this was written. So things have changed a lot. Qabus is no longer in charge in Oman. Narendra Modi is the leader of India. Burma had the democratic phase, and Sri Lanka, they've had some disorder recently. It's still a worthwhile read, and if you're searching for an introduction to the Indian Ocean and their geopolitics, I would definitely recommend you to read Monsoon. And if you enjoyed this book review, then I would recommend you to check out my book review also of Asia's Cauldron, which is a good companion novel to Monsoon, which talks about the South China Sea and the countries within it, such as Singapore, the Philippines, and Malaysia and Taiwan. Anyways, I'm the avid reader, and I will see you readers next time.